Church planting is one of the most powerful ways to expand God's kingdom. But did you know that nearly 70% of church plants fail within the first 4 years? And according to recent research, it's not because of a lack of vision. It's because of a lack of funding and resources. In today's episode, we're diving into the number one reason that church plants fail, unpacking the data from the latest report, and sharing what every church planter needs to know to avoid becoming another statistic. If you're passionate about building churches that thrive, this one's for you.
All right, Jim, so let's dive into some information here. Let's discuss what we're going to talk about first as far as what's the premise of this. We've found this study, great study by ECFA. We love them.
Our friends, we know them well.
We are big fans. And they did this really interesting study with 2,702 participants, church planters, multi-site directors, around this idea of church planting. And they've provided some really interesting information. It's over 50 denominations. The biggest association was ARC, as far as people that contributed to this.
No surprise.
Biggest denomination, Southern Baptist. No surprise there.
No surprise.
So that makes sense. So this report focuses specifically on funding issues for new churches and multi-site campuses. And so that's something that you have a great amount of knowledge about, Jim, I think. And I know you've coached many church pastors and church planters through different seasons. And so it's going to be interesting to see your insights specifically juxtaposed with some of the data. And we'll kind of dive in there. I hope we go there. This first piece of the report, we're looking at the startup and first year cost of church plants kind of juxtaposed with what ended up happening with attendance and their personal investment. The first thing I just want to throw out there, Jim, is I was surprised when I opened this up at the dollar amounts here, because based on my conversations with you and experience we've had with church leaders, this amount of funding doesn't align necessarily with what we've seen be successful.
Yeah, I when I looked at it, the numbers look lower than what I've seen anecdotally. I'm not doubting the veracity of the data. I'm just saying it's not different. It's not what I've seen. I would say most of the startup and first year costs in churches that I've coached, and again, this is not Los Angeles and Chicago and New York City. These are places like Lexington, South Carolina. They're not overly expensive. It's more like $500,000 or more because it's just expensive, right?
Yeah.
If you think through everything it takes, the startup cost, all the equipment. Now, there are times that you get some of it donated, from churches. You know, one of the things that churches that are larger like to do is let, church plants have their secondhand stuff. Yeah. So that's there, but that's not normal. Most of my clients, most of the ones that I've coached, they've had to actually purchase that. So it's a bigger number. But here's what I would say, jumped out at me in the data. There is a correlation between the investment that you make and the likely success you're going to have.
Yeah.
I'm not against bootstrapping something. Mm-hmm. I'm not. For me, I believe that a church plant deserves more intentionality than that. And that means more investment. The other thing is what most church planters do when I see their numbers, what I typically see on the front end is they've overestimated the giving from their congregation and underestimated the giving that it'll take to make it happen. And so there's actually a bigger gap than what they think there is, and I have to help them think through that.
Yeah, that's great insight. One thing that's in this graph is it's pretty clear that dollar investment versus the attendance pattern. Like we see that if you bootstrap this thing, attendance currently less than 100 after being 2+ years old, you're bootstrapping it. You're investing $70,000 in the first startup cost in first year, outside of salaries. All these numbers are outside of salaries. But look at the delta. If you invest $325, it says, in startup cost and first year cost, then you're seeing over 200 in attendance. So there is a correlation there, a unique correlation there of staffing, energy, effort, quality, whatever it may be, sustainability, perceived sustainability based on how much investment there's been and the overall operations or facility or whatever. So that's definitely a factor. And I think that aligns with some of the things that you've seen as far as there's a pretty large investment required, but it can be quite fruitful in the return.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just big on, if you're going to plant something and hope that it's going to succeed, let's make sure we invest in it properly.
Yeah, let's not let finances be the reason that we don't get off to a good start. There may be other things, other complications out there, but let's try to eliminate some of them. And one of those in a big way is finances.
Yeah, and one of the things that there's another survey, a little bit older, Church Startups and Money by Barna. Great study.
Yeah, great study.
That really came alongside a lot of the anecdotal evidence that I had. It's not only about success, it's the toll that it takes on the planter and his family.
Oh, good
right?
word. Yeah.
And so in that Church Startups and Money, there was a correlation between the funding and the success of the funding and the stress on the pastor's family. And that's a big thing. That for me is just, that's where my holy discontent around this whole topic developed some years ago at Exponential. Listening to 9 young pastors talk about the marital discord, the personal toll, the prescription medications, the counseling, and I was like, when I uncovered it, all of it was because they didn't have sufficient funding to get that church plant off the ground. So it's a big issue.
Wow, that's a good word. Okay, so here's another interesting piece of data from the report. This one shows that median worship attendance is at least 76 in new churches that became financially self-sustaining. So they hit some measure. So tell me about, over time, the giving numbers. So you've talked to me about this structure you have of kind of the efforts and the timing of fundraising for church planting. And a lot of that funding early on is from outside the church. And then at some point it shifts. How does that align your experience with 76 being kind of this attendance number that maintains some sense of self-sustaining? Where does that factor in with your 969 approach that you've shared with me in the past?
Yeah, again, I'm not going to doubt the veracity of the data here. There certainly are a lot of smaller church plants that are probably incorporated in here, but that number is significantly lower than I would have expected it to be. So when I coach churches, I'm trying to coach them to a model of funding 100% of startup externally, and then over the 3 years of their church launch, after they get it launched, over those 3 years, by year 4, they are no longer relying on anything external, no longer relying on it. And the challenge is really year 1, because it's a rare church plant, Frank, that comes to me and the planter says, "Oh, I'm trying to reach people that are already in another church." That nobody's ever said that. They're trying to reach unchurched people. Well, look, what do we know? It's hard enough to get churched people to start giving when they come into your church. It's even harder to get unchurched people to start giving. So you need to throttle way back what it takes for that group in year 1 and then move to self-sustaining. Typically, I would have expected, at least in the churches where I coach, I would have expected that number to be more like 200.
Got it. Okay, to be self-sustaining.
Because I think it takes a little more critical mass than that to be able to get to self-sustaining. Now, what this says is these are probably either smaller church plants out in rural areas or maybe in just very little niche places downtown. And I understand that. I know their data is much bigger than my anecdotal experience, but from what I've seen, those have been much larger churches.
Yeah, and factoring in maybe some of those churches are going to have a unique tension in remaining smaller because the senior pastor has to be bivocational in order to make it work with this size congregation. So definitely some complexities there.
I know there's a movement in that, and I want to make sure that there's not somebody that draws a conclusion that's inappropriate from what I've just said, and that is that bigger is better. Bigger is not necessarily better. Sometimes smaller is actually better. But I'm just speaking to the critical mass of what I see in the churches that become self-sustaining in that 4-year period.
That's great, Jim. All right, Jim. In this report, there was a pie chart. And in there, it had the 2,700 church planters that were surveyed. And I want to ask you the percentage of funding that came from different sources and things like that. So this first one, what percentage of their funding came from the core group or launch team? Not what you think it should be, okay? But what do you think actually happens in most churches across America?
You jumped in there like I might have an opinion on
Oh,
this.
Yes. Yes. So answer the question. Then
saw what
you
you
give
did
your
there.
opinion.
I saw what you did there. Okay. So that's an important facet. I always tell them you're going to have your core team and or launch team on board first. It's important for us. I'm going to go with, a lot of times those people don't have a lot of money, so I'm going to go with 15%.
Got it. Okay. According to this report, now remember they're also putting together a smaller church launch budget.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's actually 26%, but that might align with some of the numbers that you kind of came up with. Yeah. Now,
I actually like
what do you think
like
the percentage should be for a church plant? Like where would you like to see that core team contributing in that overall budget in the models that you've seen where it's been a little bit bigger and a little more outside funding?
Yeah, it's cool when they're bigger, but I just don't, in the church plants that I coach with the core team, it's just not practical because the income levels of those people is typically not enough to support it at that. So I think the answer that I gave is probably closer to what I would normally see in a church plant.
That's great.
But I definitely want them to be on board.
Yeah, absolutely. What percentage came from one or more local churches? One or more, what percentage of their overall funding came from one or more local churches? And the hint, you will be disappointed.
I will be disappointed?
I think so.
Well, you can only raise money from people you know and who like you and trust you. Okay. Right? So I'm going to say that. And churches tend to be pretty high on that list. So I'm going to go with, from the survey, I'm going to go with 30%, almost a third.
Yeah, it's 19%.
Okay, well, yeah.
I would have thought it would have been higher.
Yeah, I would have thought it'd been higher. Yeah, I'm just.
Come on, churches.
Yeah, come on. Y'all do better than that.
Come on.
Yeah, and by the way, what I tell church planners to do is, hey, Jim, you go to Pastor Frank, and you're not asking him to support your church plant per se. You're asking him, can you outsource some of your church multiplication budget or your outreach budget or your mission budget over to me? Can I become a line item in your church over the next 12 months or 2 years?
Love that.
Yeah.
What percentage came from government grants?
Oh, that's easy. Nothing.
Yeah. Less than 1%.
No, they don't support churches.
That's not going to work.
Did I get that one right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Less than 1%.
I would have been disappointed if somebody was getting money from government and my churches are not.
You're like, how did I miss that?
How did they do that?
What percentage came from one or more denominations, networks, or ministries? What percentage came from one or more denominations, networks, ministries?
I know what I've seen, but what did the survey say? What I've seen, what the survey said. I'm going to go with, I think it's more than a fourth and less than a third. I'm going to go with the 30% number again. I'm going to go with that.
19%.
Okay, again, 19%. I'm disappointed. Yeah.
Mine thought it would have been higher.
Yeah, but that actually is not too far off of where my clients tend to be. They're in the 20 to 25% range. Yeah. So I actually went a little higher than that.
Yep, that's good. What percentage came from the primary leader's household earnings and savings?
Yeah, this was, I remember seeing that on the grid, on the chart, and I know I was surprised by it because that's not generally what I see, right? They do give, read it again because it's from their savings.
What percentage came from the primary leader's household earnings and savings?
Okay, earnings and savings. Right, because I do know that they begin tithing right off the bat. It's the savings piece that I was kind of a little bit taken off on. I'm going to go with, is it the amount or the percentage? What percentage
of the overall budget?
Let's go with 10%.
15%.
That's surprising. See, that's because they're smaller churches. That's because there's smaller churches that are in here.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
so let's throw this graphic up here. When you look at this graphic, what's the story it's telling about funding from your perspective?
Well, I think one of the stories it's telling us is that there are varied avenues of funding. Don't limit yourself to just one. You have things available to you that you probably haven't even thought about. It's why when I sit down with planners, I ask them, who's your sending church? Are you involved with one of the sending networks? Who are your friends? Who are your pastor friends? One of the things that I always do is I make the church planter, before he asks anyone for money, assuming they have family and have a good relationship with their family. There are people who are estranged, but assuming they have, hey, Frank, you have family? Yeah. You on good terms? Oh, yeah. You have siblings? Yeah. Your mom and dad alive? Oh, yeah. Jessica's mom and dad alive? Oh, yeah. I want every one of them to be on board with a commitment of some kind to you. I don't care how much. He said, you say, well, my family doesn't have that much. It doesn't matter to me, Frank. I want us to be able to say before we ask anyone else that you have everyone in your family who is supporting you. Wow. Because here's why. if you come to me, now I'm a little bit more sophisticated, I know how to ask questions, and you're asking me for money, and the people who know you the best and love you the most are not behind this, why should I be?
Wow.
Right? Why should I be? And so there are places, that's the one thing that didn't get kind of mentioned on here was family and friends and things like that, because I think those are prime networks and prime sources that we don't think about. But the big story here is there's more money at your disposal through the various avenues of people and or organizations that you know than you've probably thought about.
That's fantastic. I love that. Thanks for that insight.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. And remember, what happens next Sunday could change everything.